On what was supposed to be the happiest day of her life, Rachel stood in her wedding gown, surrounded by smiling faces and floral decorations. But behind her carefully crafted smile, a nagging doubt grew larger, a suspicion she couldn't shake. Little did she know, the truth about her husband's affair would unravel in the most heart-wrenching way, turning her vow renewal into a cruel, shattering revelation. What happens when the perfect day reveals the ultimate betrayal? The sun shone brightly over the luxurious estate where Rachel Thompson was about to renew her vows with her husband, David. The grand lawn, adorned with delicate floral arrangements and elegant seating, was a perfect setting. But for Rachel, nothing was more important than her dress, a lace-trimmed gown that symbolized not only her love for David, but the renewal of their bond after a decade of marriage. Rachel had meticulously planned every detail of this day, hoping it would be a celebration of love and commitment, a chance to rekindle what she believed had faded over the years. But as she stood in front of the mirror, something gnawed at her, a quiet doubt she couldn't shake. David had grown distant recently, spending more time at work, traveling longer for business. She wanted to believe his assurances that everything was fine, that the stresses of work would soon pass, but his behavior weighed heavily on her mind. A knock interrupted her thoughts. It was Jessica Walker, the wedding planner who had become an essential part of the ceremony preparations. Jessica entered with a smile, complimenting Rachel's appearance. But there was something about her tone, something too polished, too perfect. Rachel pushed the thought aside, telling herself that she was overanalyzing everything due to pre-ceremony nerves. As Jessica left, a strange unease settled over Rachel. She glanced at her reflection, trying to convince herself that today would be perfect, that David's distant behavior was temporary. Still, beneath the excitement of the day, her mind wandered back to the subtle signs she had noticed in recent months. David's distracted smiles, his preoccupation even during moments that should have been shared between them. This was not the time for doubts, Rachel reminded herself. Today was about love, renewal, and hope for the future. Yet, as she prepared to walk down the aisle, she couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. Guests began arriving, filling the estate's grand garden with soft laughter and conversation. The picturesque scene, the pastel-colored flowers, the golden afternoon sun, the calming sound of the fountain, seemed perfect for a day that was supposed to be filled with joy. But for Rachel, standing just behind the large wooden doors, it felt anything but. Clutching her bouquet of ivory roses, she took a deep breath, hoping to calm her racing heart. Today was supposed to mark a fresh start, a new beginning for her and David. Yet the doubts she had been trying so hard to suppress gnawed at her. Something felt off, and no amount of rehearsed smiles or pleasantries could shake that feeling. On the other side of the garden, David stood with his groomsmen near the altar, greeting guests with a practiced charm. He looked every bit the man she had fallen in love with, confident, successful, but distant in a way she could no longer ignore. His smile didn't carry the warmth it once did. Rachel had noticed it before, but had tried to convince herself that it was just pre-ceremony stress. Now she wasn't so sure. Nearby, Jessica Walker moved between guests and staff, ensuring everything ran smoothly. Her efficiency was flawless, and from the outside, she appeared to be in control of every detail. But there was something about the way she glanced at David, a flicker of familiarity in her gaze, a look that Rachel couldn't fully understand, but made her stomach twist. As Rachel stood there, her best friend Samantha approached. "You ready, Rach?" she asked with a smile, squeezing her arm gently. Rachel forced a nod, her doubts still swirling. "I think so. It's just, I don't know, Sam. Something doesn't feel right." Samantha frowned, her concern evident. "What do you mean? This day is about you and David. You've been through so much together. Today's a celebration of that, right? Rachel hesitated, biting her lip. He's been distant lately, and I can't shake the feeling that something's off. Every time I try to talk to him about it, he brushes me off. Samantha gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. It's probably just nerves. David loves you. Anyone can see that. Rachel smiled faintly, but the words didn't fully comfort her. She glanced toward the altar and saw David laughing with his best man. His smile looked forced, and then she noticed it again. Jessica walking over to him, whispering something in his ear. His expression softened in a way that made Rachel's breath catch. Before she could dwell on it further, the soft strains of music began to play. The grand doors opened, revealing the garden bathed in the warm glow of the setting sun. All eyes turned to her, the guests rising to watch her walk down the aisle. With each step, Rachel felt the weight of her doubts growing heavier. She forced herself to smile, hoping no one could see the uncertainty clouding her heart. As she reached the altar and took her place beside David, she could feel the distance between them like an invisible barrier. The officiant's words filled the air, speaking of love and commitment, but Rachel barely heard him. Her thoughts kept drifting to the subtle looks and the strange tension she had noticed between David and Jessica. Was it her imagination, or was there something more beneath the surface of their perfect day? For now, Rachel pushed her doubts aside, but deep down she knew that the truth, whatever it was waiting to reveal itself. As the officiant continued his speech, the words about love and renewal seemed to echo hollowly in Rachel's ears. Standing beside David, her hand loosely holding his, she could no longer ignore the growing chasm between them. What was supposed to be a reaffirmation of their life together felt more like an illusion. She glanced at David. He was smiling, too calmly, too perfectly. His expression seemed rehearsed, as though he were playing a role in a scene he no longer believed in. Rachel's heart sank. The man who used to look at her with adoration now felt distant, unreachable. The doubts she had worked so hard to bury were now rising to the surface, demanding to be faced. Her thoughts drifted back to the early days of their relationship, a time when David had been attentive, loving, and thoughtful. She remembered how he'd surprise her with small gestures, how his eyes would light up when he saw her. But now, those memories felt like they belonged to someone else. His passion had been replaced by an unspoken tension, an absence that Rachel had tried to ignore for months. David's work had always been demanding, but recently, the long hours and extended business trips had left her feeling abandoned. She had convinced herself that his career was simply more stressful than usual, but now, standing at the altar, Rachel knew there was more to it. There had been late-night phone calls, hushed conversations when he thought she wasn't paying attention, and the constant distance even when he was physically present. The officiant's voice broke through her thoughts, calling David to recite his vows. Rachel's heart tightened as she turned to face him, bracing herself for words that once would have filled her with joy. "Rachel," David began, his voice steady but lacking the emotion she longed to hear. "These past 10 years have been the most incredible journey. We've built a life together that I'm proud of, and I know, no matter what comes our way, we'll face it together." The words were beautiful, but to Rachel they felt empty, like lines spoken without conviction. She could hear the quiet approval of the guests behind them, but to her it was all background noise. David's promises, once so meaningful, now seemed like part of the facade they were both trying to maintain. "I promise to stand by your side," David continued, "to love and support you through everything life brings our way. You're my partner, my best friend, and I'm grateful for the life we've built." Rachel forced a smile, but inside she felt the weight of the growing doubts. His words felt scripted, lacking the intimacy she had once cherished. And then, there it was again, that nagging feeling that something was missing, that David was holding back a truth he couldn't bring himself to speak. Her gaze shifted briefly to Jessica, who stood just behind the guests, clipboard in hand, watching the ceremony with calm composure. There was nothing outwardly suspicious about her demeanor, but the tension in the air told a different story. Rachel's stomach twisted as she noticed Jessica glance in David's direction, her expression unreadable but strangely attentive. As David finished his vows, his smile softened, and for a fleeting moment Rachel wanted to believe him. But the doubt lingered, casting a shadow over the ceremony. It was her turn to speak, but as she opened her mouth, she found herself struggling to find the words. How could she promise to love and honor David when she wasn't sure she knew him anymore? How could she stand in front of their friends and family, pretending that everything was fine, when deep down she feared it wasn't? The silence stretched for a moment, and she could see the flicker of concern cross David's face. She cleared her throat and forced herself to speak. "David, these past 10 years have been—" She paused, her voice faltering as she felt the weight of her hesitation. An incredible journey. She could hear her voice tremble slightly, but she pressed on. "I've always believed that love is built on trust, on honesty, and on commitment. And that's what I've tried to give you every day of our life together." David's smile faltered, and Rachel could see the tension ripple through his face. She continued, her voice quiet but firm. "But love isn't just about the good times. It's about facing the truth together, no matter how hard that truth might be." The words hung heavy in the air, and Rachel saw the flash of discomfort in David's eyes. She finished her vows, but the doubt remained, gnawing at her like a persistent ache. She had spoken the words, but deep down she knew something was wrong. Rachel's heart was pounding as the officiant called for the exchange of rings. The ceremony continued, but for her it was all a blur. David took her hand and slid the ring onto her finger with practiced ease, but his touch felt cold, distant. Her own hand trembled slightly as she placed the ring on his finger, a motion that had once felt symbolic of their unbreakable bond, now felt hollow. As the officiant declared their vows renewed, polite applause rippled through the gathered guests. Rachel smiled, but it felt forced, a mask to hide the turmoil swirling inside her. The perfect day, the one she had meticulously planned, suddenly felt like an elaborate lie. She could see the joy on the faces of their friends and family, completely unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. David leaned in to kiss her on the cheek. "We did it," he whispered softly, but his words barely registered. Her mind was elsewhere, replaying every subtle glance and exchange she had witnessed between him and Jessica over the past weeks. As they began to walk back down the aisle, David's hand in hers felt unfamiliar, like holding on to a stranger. She could see Jessica moving efficiently through the guests, attending to the event details, but there was a certain confidence in her posture that Rachel couldn't ignore. It was almost as if Jessica knew something Rachel didn't, a secret that had been carefully concealed beneath her polished professionalism. When they reached the end of the aisle, Rachel felt an overwhelming need to escape the crowd, to breathe and collect herself. "I'll be right back," she murmured to David, offering a quick, tight smile before slipping away toward the quiet side garden. As she walked through the peaceful garden, the soft laughter and clinking glasses from the reception faded behind her. The quiet should have been soothing, but her mind was racing. The nagging doubts she had been pushing aside for so long were now fully in focus, demanding answers she wasn't sure she was ready to face. She thought back to small moments, David's late nights, the secretive phone calls he took in the other room, the times he seemed distracted even when he was home. How had she dismissed these signs for so long? How had she convinced herself that everything was fine when the cracks in their marriage had been so clearly visible? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind her. She turned quickly, startled, only to see Jessica approaching with a concerned look on her face. "Rachel, are you okay?" Jessica's voice was calm, soothing even, but there was something about her presence that made Rachel's skin crawl. Rachel forced a smile, trying to mask the flood of emotions welling up inside her. "I'm fine," she lied, her voice steady, even though her mind was spinning. "I just needed a moment to clear my head." Jessica stepped closer, her eyes scanning Rachel's face. "It's understandable," she said, her tone too understanding. "Today is a big day for you." Rachel nodded but felt suffocated by Jessica's presence. It was strange, the way Jessica seemed to always appear at the right moment, as though she had been watching everything unfold from the sidelines. And then there was that familiar look she shared with David earlier, the one that had sent Rachel's doubts spiraling. "I appreciate all your help with today," Rachel said, her voice more composed than she felt. "I couldn't have done it without you." Jessica smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm just glad I could make it special for you." There was something off in her tone, a subtle hint of something Rachel couldn't quite place. She had trusted Jessica to plan the most important day of her life, but now, standing here alone with her, Rachel wondered if that trust had been misplaced. With a tight smile, Rachel excused herself and turned back toward the reception, her mind racing with suspicion. She needed space to think, but more than that, she needed answers. If something was going on between David and Jessica, she had to find out the truth. And soon. The reception was in full swing by the time Rachel returned, though the laughter and conversation now felt distant to her. The guests, blissfully unaware of the turmoil inside her, raised their glasses in celebration, toasting to what they believed was a perfect union. But Rachel's thoughts were far from celebratory. Across the room, David was deep in conversation with a group of his colleagues, smiling and laughing in a way that felt practiced, even forced. He looked so at ease, so comfortable in the world they had built together. Rachel, however, saw the cracks. His charm now felt like a mask, concealing something she hadn't wanted to see. Her eyes scanned the room until they landed on Jessica, who was still moving between guests, coordinating every detail with her usual efficiency. But it wasn't Jessica's professionalism that caught Rachel's attention. It was the way she occasionally glanced toward David, as if checking on him, a subtle and almost hidden connection between the two of them. It sent a chill down Rachel's spine. Rachel needed answers. The subtle glances, the strange familiarity between them, it all seemed too calculated. There had to be more to it. Her mind raced as she excused herself from a polite conversation with a family member and slipped quietly into the house, seeking some solitude. Once inside, she found a quiet corner and leaned against the wall, her heart pounding in her chest. Her phone buzzed in her purse, pulling her back to the moment. She pulled it out, half expecting a congratulatory message from a friend. Instead, what she saw made her stomach drop. A text message from an unknown number. It was short, just one line. "Check David's messages with Jessica." Rachel's breath caught in her throat. Her fingers trembled as she stared at the message. Who would send this? And how did they know? The timing, the specific mention of David and Jessica, it was too precise to be a coincidence. For a moment, Rachel considered ignoring it. Maybe it was just someone playing a cruel trick on her, but deep down, she knew she couldn't ignore it. The nagging doubts, the strange behavior, the quiet looks between David and Jessica, this was the confirmation she had been dreading. She slipped the phone back into her purse, her mind racing. How was she supposed to check David's messages? He was always careful with his phone, never leaving it unattended. But she knew there had to be a moment, an opportunity where she could get a glimpse of the truth. Determined, Rachel made her way upstairs to their bedroom, where David had left his jacket earlier. Maybe his phone was still in there. Her heart raced as she quietly opened the door to the room. The air inside felt heavy, as if the walls themselves were keeping secrets. Her eyes landed on David's jacket, draped over the back of a chair, but his phone wasn't there. Rachel let out a shaky breath, her pulse quickening. Maybe it was a dead end. But just as she was about to leave, she heard a faint buzzing sound. Her eyes darted toward the nightstand. There, lying next to the charger, was David's phone, softly vibrating. Her heart pounded in her ears as she walked over to it. She knew the passcode. They had always shared those things. At least, she had thought they had. Now, as she picked up his phone, it felt like crossing a line she could never uncross. With trembling hands, Rachel entered the passcode. The phone unlocked, and a flood of emotions hit her. Her thumb hovered over the messaging app. It would only take one tap, but the truth, whatever it was, would change everything. She typed Jessica into the search bar, her breath catching in her throat. A series of messages popped up. As she began to scroll through them, her worst fears slowly unraveled. At first, the messages seemed professional, updates about the vow renewal, small details about the event. But as she scrolled further, the tone shifted. The messages became more personal, more intimate. Late-night exchanges, moments of flirtation, coded language that left little to the imagination. One message from David stood out, sent just a few nights before. "You looked incredible today. I can't stop thinking about you." Rachel's world shattered. The words blurred in front of her eyes as her stomach twisted in pain. There it was, the confirmation she had feared. David and Jessica weren't just planning her vow renewal. They had been planning something else entirely, something that had been going on behind her back for months. Her hands shook as she scrolled through more messages, each one cutting deeper than the last. And then, one final message from David, sent just before the ceremony, sealed it. "After the ceremony, we'll figure everything out. Just be patient." Rachel's tears fell freely now, her heart breaking under the weight of the betrayal. David had been lying to her all along, right under her nose. The carefully constructed life she had fought to preserve was a lie, and the truth was too painful to bear. She locked the phone and placed it back on the nightstand, her chest tight with grief. The reception was still in full swing downstairs, but Rachel knew she couldn't confront David here, not in front of everyone. She needed to process this. She needed time. Taking a deep breath, Rachel wiped her eyes and steeled herself. This vow renewal, this supposed celebration of love, was over. What came next would be entirely different. Rachel descended the stairs slowly, her legs shaky as the full weight of her discovery pressed down on her. The laughter and music of the reception felt like a cruel contrast to the turmoil swirling inside her. The guests, completely oblivious to the betrayal that had unfolded, danced and celebrated, as though this day was still a perfect union of love, but for Rachel, the reality was far darker. As she scanned the crowd, her eyes immediately landed on David. He was by the bar, laughing with friends, a glass of champagne in his hand. He looked relaxed, at ease, as if nothing had changed, as if he hadn't been lying to her for months. Rachel's stomach churned at the sight of him, the mask he wore so flawlessly making her feel like a stranger to the man she once loved. She had to talk to him, had to confront him, but not here, not in front of their family and friends. The humiliation would be unbearable, and she wasn't ready to expose the ugly truth to everyone just yet. Rachel took a deep breath and approached him, her heart pounding with each step. "David," she said softly, just loud enough for him to hear over the noise of the reception. He turned toward her, his smile brightening as if he hadn't a care in the world. "There's my beautiful wife," he said, reaching for her hand. Rachel flinched at his touch, a surge of anger rushing through her, but she forced herself to keep her voice calm. "Can we talk?" she asked quietly, her tone steady but firm. David's smile faltered slightly, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. "Of course," he said, his brow furrowing in concern. "Is everything okay?" Rachel swallowed hard, nodding toward the side garden. "Let's go outside for a minute. I need some air." Without waiting for his response, she turned and led the way toward the garden. The cool night air hit her as they stepped outside, offering a brief respite from the suffocating tension she felt inside. The soft sounds of the reception drifted in the background as Rachel walked toward the garden railing, trying to steady her breath, her mind racing with how she would approach this confrontation. David followed, his concern growing more evident. "Rach, what's going on?" he asked, his tone light, almost playful, as if trying to keep things casual. Rachel turned to face him, her arms crossed protectively over her chest. The weight of what she had just uncovered bore down on her, threatening to break her resolve. "I found something," she said, her voice shaking with a mixture of anger and pain. David's smile disappeared entirely now, replaced by a look of confusion. "What do you mean? What did you find?" Rachel's fingers clenched into fists at her sides, her nails digging into her palms as she spoke the words that felt like poison on her tongue. "I know about you and Jessica," she said, her voice cold and unwavering. For a moment, David was silent, his face going pale as her words hung in the air. His eyes widened in shock, his expression one of disbelief. "What?" he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "I know," Rachel repeated, pulling the phone out of her pocket and holding it up as if it were a damning piece of evidence. "I saw the messages, David. I know everything." David's eyes flicked to the phone, panic flashing across his face. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words seemed to fail him. "Rachel, don't lie to me," Rachel snapped, cutting him off before he could try to defend himself. "Not anymore. I know about the affair. How long has this been going on?" David's face drained of color, and for the first time, Rachel saw the guilt written clearly across his features. He wasn't going to deny it. He couldn't. "I'm sorry," David whispered, his voice barely audible. "I never meant for this to happen." Rachel's heart shattered at his words, but she steeled herself against the pain. "You never meant for it to happen," she repeated bitterly. "How long, David? How long have you been lying to me?" David stood frozen, guilt etched across his face, unable to meet Rachel's piercing gaze. "A few months," he finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Rachel felt the world tilt beneath her feet. "A few months?" All this time, while she had been planning their vow renewal, David had been betraying her. She clenched her fists, fighting back the tears threatening to spill. "A few months?" she repeated, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and disbelief. "While I was planning this ceremony, while I was trying to hold our family together, you were with her." David's silence spoke volumes. He didn't try to offer an excuse, didn't attempt to downplay what had happened. He simply looked at her, the shame and regret evident in his eyes. "I didn't want to hurt you," he said weakly, stepping closer, but Rachel stepped back, putting distance between them. "Didn't want to hurt me?" Rachel's voice rose, her anger spilling over. "You didn't want to hurt me, but you lied to me, over and over again. You let me believe we were building something, while you were sneaking around with her." David ran a hand through his hair, clearly at a loss for words. "It wasn't supposed to happen this way," he said, his voice shaking now. "It was a mistake, something that just happened." Rachel's fury only deepened. "Just happened?" she spat. "You don't just fall into an affair, David. You made a choice to betray me, to destroy everything we've built." He looked away, the weight of his guilt too much for him to bear. "I ended it," he said softly, "before the ceremony. I knew I couldn't keep going like this." Rachel let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "Oh, so that's supposed to make it better? You think that makes what you did any less disgusting?" David's eyes flicked back to hers, pleading. "Rachel, I love you. I know I messed up, but I love you. I don't want to lose you." Rachel felt a pang of pain at his words, but she refused to let herself be swayed. "You already lost me," she whispered, her voice hollow, "the moment you chose her over us." A sudden movement caught her eye, and Rachel turned to see Jessica standing at the entrance to the garden, her eyes locking with Rachel's for just a split second before she quickly averted her gaze. Rachel's blood boiled at the sight of her. There she was, standing in the shadows, pretending as if she hadn't played a role in the destruction of Rachel's marriage. Without a second thought, Rachel marched toward Jessica, her heart pounding with anger. Jessica's composed expression faltered as Rachel approached, and for a moment she seemed unsure of what to do. "Rachel," she started, her voice calm but cautious. "Is everything okay?" Rachel's voice shook with rage as she spoke. "You know damn well everything is not okay," she hissed, her eyes burning with anger. "I know about the affair." Jessica stiffened, her face paling. "Rachel, Don't you dare!" Rachel snapped, cutting her off. "You stood there, planning my vow renewal, pretending to be so helpful, while all the while you were sneaking around with my husband. How could you do that?" Jessica faltered, unable to maintain her composed facade. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "David and I—" Rachel's fury erupted. "David and you what? Destroyed my life, shattered my trust. You're just as responsible for this as he is, Jessica. You're both disgusting." Jessica's eyes filled with tears, but Rachel wasn't moved. The damage had been done. There was no room for pity, no space for forgiveness. "I'm sorry," Jessica whispered, her voice trembling. "I never wanted to hurt you." Rachel's laugh was bitter, hollow. "You never wanted to hurt me? You've been lying to me for months, standing by my side, smiling while you were betraying me. Don't tell me you didn't want to hurt me." Without waiting for a response, Rachel turned and walked away, her heart pounding in her chest. The anger still burned hot inside her, but so did the pain. David's betrayal was one thing, but Jessica's role in it, someone she had trusted, someone who had been so deeply involved in the most important day of her life, made it all the more unbearable. As she left them both behind, Rachel knew one thing for sure: this wasn't something she could ever forgive. Rachel re-entered the reception hall, her heart shattered but her resolve firm. The sounds of laughter, clinking glasses and cheerful conversation felt distant, almost surreal. It was as if the entire room was celebrating a lie she had lived for months. Her eyes scanned the room, seeing only the betrayal that had taken place behind the smiles of their family and friends. David hadn't followed her. He was likely still in the garden, trying to figure out how to salvage what remained of his life. Rachel didn't care. She was done with him, done with the lies, done with pretending. Her best friend Samantha spotted her from across the room, immediately sensing something was wrong. She made her way over to Rachel with a concerned look. "Rach, what's going on?" "You look pale," she whispered, gently taking Rachel's arm. Rachel swallowed hard, trying to keep her composure. "Can we talk outside?" she said softly, her voice barely steady. Samantha nodded, and the two slipped out of the reception hall, moving to a quieter spot in the garden. The cool night air offered some relief, but the storm raging inside Rachel was far from calm. "It's David," Rachel whispered, her voice breaking. He's been having an affair. With Jessica. Samantha's eyes widened in shock, her hand flying to her mouth. What? Are you serious? Rachel, no. I can't believe it. Rachel nodded, the tears she had been holding back finally spilling over. I found their messages. It's been going on for months, Sam. While I was planning this whole thing, trying to make our marriage work, he was with her. Samantha pulled Rachel into a tight embrace, her voice trembling with anger. That's disgusting. How could they do this to you? I'm so sorry, Rach. You don't deserve any of this. Rachel wiped her tears, her sorrow slowly turning into a cold, hardened resolve. I'm done, Sam. I can't stay here. I can't keep pretending everything is okay. Samantha squeezed her hand. You don't have to. You don't owe anyone anything. Let's get you out of here. Quietly. No one needs to know right now. With Samantha's help, Rachel quietly slipped out of the reception, avoiding any curious eyes. As they made their way to the car, Rachel felt the weight of the betrayal pressing down on her. This wasn't the life she had envisioned, but she knew she couldn't stay, not after everything that had happened. The marriage she had fought so hard to save was over, and nothing would ever be the same. In the days that followed, Rachel packed her belongings and moved into Samantha's guest room. The aftermath of the vow renewal was a blur, and she couldn't bring herself to speak to David. He had tried calling and texting, but Rachel was done with explanations, done with apologies. She had given him her trust, her love, and he had shattered it beyond repair. Each morning, Rachel would sit on Samantha's porch, sipping coffee as the sun rose, trying to piece together the fragments of her life. The pain was still fresh, but with each passing day, she felt a small glimmer of hope. Hope that she could move forward, even if it would take time. One morning, as Rachel stared at the sunrise, Samantha joined her, sitting beside her with 2 mugs of coffee. "How are you holding up?" Samantha asked softly. Rachel offered a faint smile, a bit more genuine than before. "Better, I think. It's hard, but I'm getting there." Samantha nodded, giving her a reassuring smile. "You're stronger than you know, Rach. You'll get through this." Rachel gazed out at the horizon, the first rays of sunlight breaking through the clouds. For the first time in weeks, she believed it. She would be okay. It would take time, and the scars of David's betrayal would remain, but she knew she could rebuild her life. As the sun rose higher in the sky, Rachel realized something she hadn't before. While her marriage had ended, her life hadn't. There was still so much ahead of her, so much she had yet to experience. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time, she felt ready to face it. Because the truth was, Rachel was stronger than she ever knew, and whatever came next, she would face it with her head held high. Rachel's journey wasn't easy, but it was hers. The betrayal had nearly broken her, but in the end, she found strength in herself. The life she had built with David was over, but a new chapter awaited her, one she would write on her own terms, free from the lies that had once held her back.